Hello. All right, part 2 of chapter 4. So here we're going to get right into inflammation. We talk quite a bit about it. Inflammation is a response that happens when your body has an insult. And you're familiar with inflammation. You cut your finger, it gets red and swollen, and eventually it heals. And then repair. So let's get right to it. Part 2. So maybe a little dramatic with the flames. All right, I just went with the flames anyway, because inflammation, that's where it comes from. It means your finger is swollen, like my thumb was there. You feel the hotness to it, and it's red. So that's where it came from. And it is a stereotypical response that happens, your body does, to try to minimize the damage, kill the invader of the problem, and get you back to normal. And so it does whatever it can. This inflammation is important to your survival. People without an inflammatory response for some reason are going to have infections are going to kill them because they're not responding properly. So although it's a pain in the butt to have like this, it's a cut on my thumb. I was cleaning moose skulls and dirty things, and then once, you're like, oh, well, I'll wash it off a little bit, maybe put a Band-Aid on it, but it's happened twice, but let's not get into it. I need antibiotics because this, if it spreads, that was actually, it can kill you. Right? It can go up my arm and that'll be it. So, yeah, the miracle of antibiotics, we've learned to control a lot of these bacterial infections. But what happens in inflammation, I'm going to tell you again here, is that the blood vessels in the area dilate. They get big, and that's going to make more fluid rush into the tissue. So it's going to be swollen. It's going to feel warm because of the blood, and because there's a lot of activity. The cells are very metabolically active, contributes to that. And then it's going to bring more white blood cells. And actually, there's changes that occur that make the white blood cells stick to the capillary and leave to go, because that's where the fight is. And then our white blood cells will follow the chemical trail to find the bad guys. This is amazing, huh? And then those white blood cells will give off chemicals, these cytokines and other chemicals that will encourage more to come. It'll make the vessel nearby swollen, and it'll make more, it's to bring all that you can to the fight. And then if it's a serious one, you'll even have clotting factors come in, making like this fibrous kind of a wall that's going to kind of keep the infection localized, keep the bad guys localized. So pretty amazing. And at the end, it's all going to be turned around, right? You want it to all go back to normal eventually. So you need to do that. And then once you've fought the infection, then you have the whole repair we'll talk about. How do you go back to normal skin after this cut? And skin happens to heal really well, bones, things like that. But you have a heart tissue, brain tissue, and damage. It's not gonna, you're gonna make scar tissue. It's not gonna go back to the original. So we'll talk about that. So inflammation, you can see I have this splinter. Of course, it's filled with everything from the environment. That gets in there, and it would love to live inside you. Those bacteria. It's warm, it's wet. There's lots of nutrients, right? Oxygen, but your body does not like that, and so your body is going to put up the good fight, and it's going to make the capillaries expand, like I say, bring the white blood cells to fight that fight. So limit extent of injury, remove the necrotic debris once it kills that, and even kind of, usually in this kind of situation, it ends up killing neighboring healthy cells, but it's trying to make sure you've got rid of the invader so that it's gone, right? And then get ready for the healing process. So when you hear a stereotype response, all these things happen usually with inflammation. There can be various degrees, but you're going to see all these things happen. That's what it means, a stereotypical response. So first, talk about acute inflammation. You got to cut, something like that. And then later we'll talk about chronic inflammation, which is a problem. Often we don't even know the cause of it, but acute inflammation, normal. It's what happens when you guys get an infection, a cut, damage. So the vascular phase is when the blood flow is going to be increased to that area. And remember, with the blood comes the white blood cells that can fight the infection. And the capillary is going to be very permeable, holy, leaky, and that's going to cause the swelling, the edema of the tissue. as well as allow proteins to get in there, allow white blood cells to get in there so they can get in the tissue and find the bad guys. So this shows nicely capillary, and it's showing dilation. You can see it's much bigger, right? And more permeable. The holes are bigger, definitely. When you hear hyperemia, hyperemia means the blood vessels are expanded. The area often looks red when you see that. So vasodilation and more permeability are going to cause more fluid to leave and get into the tissue, swelling up that tissue. And then cellular phase is when you're going to have the cavalry are going to leave the blood and go to the injury site and start killing the bad guys and cleaning up. So these are the signs: inflammation, redness, more blood flow, swelling, leakier capillaries, more fluid leaves, heat, more blood flow and more activity, pain, chemicals given off by the bacteria and the surrounding cells are going to stimulate your nerves, are going to cause you to feel it. And it could be loss of function if it's bad. So what you want to do, of course, is limit this bacteria or whatever injury. You want to keep that causative agent. You want to keep it down. You want to prevent it from dividing and hopefully destroy it and remove it and all the damage that has been done. And phagocytosis is our main weapon. We have our two main phagocytes, neutrophils and macrophages. And macrophages are bigger and they can eat more variety of things, bigger things, and more of them. They live longer. Neutrophils, they throw themselves in there. They eat a dozen or so bacteria, and then they blow up and turn to pus. But you've got so many of them that they're really good to bring in there. So this vascular phase, let's get to that, how you make capillaries leakier and how you increase blood flow. So the chemical, especially histamine. So y'all heard of antihistamines. You take those to cause your nasal passages to come down, right? Or if you have an allergic reaction, antihistamines will help you control that edema, that swelling. So histamine is a chemical that causes capillaries to swell and become leakier, more permeable. And mast cells are types of basophils, white blood cells, that are all over the place in tissues. And they sit there, and when there's damage, they release their contents. Histamine will cause the neighboring capillary to swell. They also have heparin, which you guys remember that. Sounds familiar, maybe tubes of blood are heparin coated. It's going to cause anticoagulant. It's going to cause the blood to flow more, and histamine is going to dilate those vessels. Yeah. And so when you have a bigger vessel, a leakier vessel, more fluid's going to come out, and that cut's going to feel tight and swollen from all that fluid. That increasing in diameter of the vessel causes the more blood flow, but it kind of slows down, but more of it. And the white blood cells will be pushed to the margin, where they're going to like travel towards the outside of the capillary. They're more likely to get stuck on that wall and leave. We'll talk more about that for sure. And so you see marginated white blood cells means that the white blood cells are pushed to the outside, and then the endothelial lining of the capillary, these squamous cells that line the capillaries, are going to put out these kind of sticky proteins that come off their cell membrane. They're going to cause these white blood cells to stick to them, called cell adhesion molecules. Are going to stick to them. So the white blood cells will come down, they'll kind of roll along the surface, and they'll stick to some of these adhesion molecules that are given off by the endothelium of the capillary when it's being told, dude, we need more white blood cells. And then that white blood cell, as it's stopped now, then it can leave through a pore between the endothelial cells, and it can find its way into the tissue. And then it follows the chemical trail of the bacteria or the other white blood cells giving off chemicals. It follows that trail to where it's needed. Chemotaxis, it's called. Beautiful, showing a white blood cell. I bet I have even more detailed picture. Oh, look at that, look at that. So you don't have to know these particular molecules or anything like that. But you do need to know the white blood cells are marginalized, are brought to the margin of the blood vessel, and then there's going to be adhesion molecules coming off the surface of the blood vessel when there's an infection. They come off, causes the white blood cell to stick to it, and then it's going to leave the blood and go into the tissue. When I taught this, it's called diapedesis, when white blood cells leave the vascular system and get into the tissues. And then once it's into the tissue, it's in the right spot, because that's an area where the capillaries are saying, dude, we need help. And then they're going to follow find the bad guys, and then chemokines, cytokines, or chemicals given off that are going to help this process happen along. So neutrophils, let's talk a little more about them. The most common white blood cell that you saw in your blood smear. Here's a video of one chasing some bacteria. So they find bad guys that are not too big, and they engulf them, phagocytize them, and a lysosome will fuse with that vacuole. It'll give off all these chemicals that will destroy the bacteria and get rid of it. And once it eats enough of them, neutrophils die, they burst, turn into pus. So you're going to see neutrophils at the site. If you have a heart attack, within hours, or less than hours, you're going to see neutrophils all over that heart. So you can tell an acute infection, neutrophils are there really quickly. Macrophages are a little slower. Pictures of pus. Try Google imaging pus for this thing. Yeah, it's some disgusting images, but y'all familiar, pus is a yellowish, thick fluid. And what it is degraded tissue and neutrophils. And that's what it is. Purulent. We'll talk a little more about when we talk about pus. And so lysosomal enzymes. And then these free radicals, maybe you've heard about that, some diets to help prevent free radicals so you don't age, etc. It's talking about things like hydrogen peroxide. And those chemicals will destroy any kind of tissue. And those, you guys interested in nursing and such, why you use hydrogen peroxide is that you have an enzyme in all your tissues called catalase. And hydrogen peroxide, when it hits it, it degrades and turns into the oxygen, and that's all the bubbles. So the reason we put hydrogen peroxide on a cut is to make those bubbles to kind of dislodge any foreign material, any dirt or anything. It kind of brings it to the surface. So that's how hydrogen peroxide works. Yeah. So macrophages, again, they're bigger, they can eat more, they last longer, they do some other things. So they come and they later, and then they play a big role in cleaning up the debris and bringing your tissue back to normal. Yeah, so when you look at a particular tissue that's been inflamed tissue, you can see that if you see tons of neutrophils, probably going after a particular bacteria. I can see staphylococcus, streptococcus, anaerobes from the gut, things like that. They're just always staph in your skin, strep in your throat, anaerobes in your gut. They're always kind of leaking into your body. So neutrophils they're so common because they're always there to kind of keep them at bay, keep them where they belong, right? They're still in your throat or in your gut, but we don't want them in our other tissues. So neutrophils are always, ready for that. Definitely, yes. And again, pyogenic is pus-forming bacteria. So yeah, and a lot of macrophages, if it's more of a chronic infection, acute, neutrophils are there right away. All right, now there's some chemistry here. We'll talk about some molecular mediators of inflammation. These are chemicals that are gonna influence inflammation. And there's chemicals that it's a positive feedback loop where when there's an infection, there's the blood vessels are expanded, more white blood cells come out, more white blood cells send out more chemicals, which make more white blood cells come out. So it kind of builds. And then there needs to be a dismantling of the inflammatory response on the other end where you stop it. But it builds quickly because it's life or death. You're going to send the cavalry to fight, or it's going to overtake your body. But histamine, super important in the beginning. It's going to, it's released by these mast cells, and it causes the capillaries to dilate and become leaky. you'll see these other chemicals will take over a little bit doing that as well. There's other chemicals that will dilate your vessels, but histamine right away happens. Yep. And then you'll see cells on the surface of the blood vessel and on the white blood cells. I'm sorry, see molecules are given off by both of those that are going to be mediators of this inflammatory response. So it's not just white blood cells leading it, it's all the cells in the area will be giving off chemicals that will help mediate this inflammatory response. And so I like this diagram here. It's showing you like what is bringing the white blood cells, how they know where to go. Chemotaxis, because it can be the bacteria themselves, and it's going to be the white blood cells that found them releasing chemicals. There's going to be a chemical gradient that these white blood cells, which can move, they're going to follow that chemical gradient. As long as it keeps getting more concentrated, they're on the right path and they'll get to where they need to go. And then there's other chemicals, see plasma derived. There's chemicals within your plasma in your blood that are there to help with this inflammatory response too. So you have the lining your blood vessels, endothelial cells giving off signals. You have the macrophages and the neutrophils giving off chemical signals. You've got mast cells that are giving off chemical signals. And then you have chemicals in the blood. They're all involved in this complex inflammatory response. It is complex. So some of these ones that come from chemicals in your plasma, we'll talk about these individually. Kinin complements, you may have heard of that, and coagulation, blood coagulation. These things are chemicals that are, your liver makes all these proteins and then they're just in your bloodstream ready to go. So your body is ready all the time if it needs an inflammatory response. And it has these chemicals that are in your blood. Now the thing is, how do you prevent endless activation? If you're constantly in inflammatory response, you're going to burn out, right? You're not going to be healthy at all. So there has to be ways to get rid of it. And one of the most common, this is also with, when you think about blood coagulation, like you're kind of living on the edge because if you have too much coagulation, you have clots everywhere, right? Not enough, you're going to have leaks. So it's just this balance. And one thing really is dilution. So I have a picture of a river here, and just the constant blood flow doesn't allow a buildup of these chemicals. So in blood coagulation, you have chemicals that cause the blood to coagulate on its own, but the constant flowing, it's often why you put heat on a swollen area, because it keeps the blood flowing quicker and it removes these chemicals that are causing this big immune response, this big hyper response. So just simply dilution of not letting those chemicals build up is going to help. Yeah, so you have pro-inflammatory molecules. You also have inhibitors, right? And so by the end of this, you got to slow this down. It's like I say, it's positive feedback, and there's got to be a point where you take it back. All right, should I take more pauses? I don't know if it helps. You guys can pause it on your computer. In a real lecture, you can't pause me, right? You just got to, but here you can always stop, I guess. This is a real lecture, by the way, but I mean, recorded. All right, some other things you're going to hear about, this is kind of fascinating here too, is the kinins are broken down to become bradykinin. Maybe you haven't heard about bradykinin, but bradykinin is important in pain relief. We'll talk about that a little bit. It causes pain. So bradykinins are going to come in and work after histamine works. Bradykinins will keep your capillaries dilated. So it makes your capillaries leaky, and it also causes pain too. Then you also have fibrinogen. Remember clotting? Fibrinogen, remember that? Prothrombin, thrombin turns fibrinogen into fibrin. Fibrin is the sticky mass that makes your blood clots. Well, there's fibrinogen coming out. It's a big molecule, but if it becomes leaky enough, so you can see only when it's a severe response, fibrinogen leaves your blood and it gets out there too. And so you're going to make fibrin. So kind of a clot. That's how I talk about the walling off. So severe infection, you're fighting it. You're going to start making this kind of a firewall between the infection and the rest of your body. And then Hagman factor, yes, is important in clotting and also in making this happen. So you need it's a complex cascade of chemical reactions, right? Complement. Now, maybe you heard about complement. We talked about the immune system. You learned about the immune system. But it's a bunch of proteins that help with your immune reaction. In this case, complement is going to just ramps up the immune reaction. It's going to get everyone excited, and it's also complement can directly, those proteins can punch holes in bacteria, kill it directly. You can also see a different complement is going to make mast cells secrete more histamine, right? And complement is going to help make a chemical gradient to attract the macrophages, but also neutrophils. So complement our protein system important in the immune response and in inflammation too. Yes, so, my gosh, we have plasma proteins. So we got the white blood cells, the endothelial cells, platelets. All these things are making chemicals that are going to amplify and sustain this inflammatory response, because it's life or death here. You know, you're fighting the bad guys. And so I've already told you lysosomal enzymes can break down almost anything. And then you've got like free radicals that can destroy maybe foreign substances, you know, to help break that down. It's in there. And so all these things are going to turn to pus, right? And then in my pharmacy world, my other world here, I remember studying this about arachidonic acid is going to, it's a big molecule found in cell membranes. And what happens is that that breaks down the inflammatory response, and it makes prostaglandins. Maybe you learned that about pain. So prostaglandins are going to help with this inflammatory response, and they particularly cause pain. Like it makes the nerve endings respond. And so some drugs that we use will help inhibit this breakdown of arachidonic acid. And when you hear about NSAIDs, right? Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like aspirin and ibuprofen, they're going to work by inhibiting this breakdown. And so you don't have that pain, you don't have that inflammation. And then steroids, you know, or steroids, prednisone, other steroids, steroid cream you put on, that also, you know, inhibits your immune response and inhibits the inflammatory response. So we have drugs that will get in there if you have an overreaction, you know, too much inflammation, that NSAIDs and steroids inhibit inflammation, and they work by inhibiting making that prostaglandins. And cytokines, if you remember from your immune system lectures, cytokines are given off by cells, of course, and they have effects that are going to help amplify this inflammation. So some of them, yeah, tumor necrosis factor, a whole bunch of interleukins, 1 through who knows how many. But these cytokines help the white blood cells stick to the blood vessels so they can get out of there, increase the coagulation. Prostaglandins, I talked about stopping it with aspirin, but this is going to increase it, right? And then fever. I'll talk about fever and making more white blood cells. Increase sleep, decrease appetite. That sounds like you're sick, like you have a problem, right? And then what causes a fever, just to review for you guys, is these white blood cells will give off interleukin-1, which is going to travel to your hypothalamus, and it's going to reset your temperature a little bit higher. And then why do we get a fever? We used to think that, you know, we should quash all fevers, but now we know we should let the fever go, right? Because it's not a symptom you have to take care of. It's your body purposely resetting your temperature. And when it makes it the less temperature, the microbes like it at body temperature. So you're making it uncomfortable for the microbes. And then you're also making your phagocytes more excited. And it turns out the higher temperature you take iron out of your blood and you store it in your liver and your spleen, and microbes need iron to grow too. So that helps. So all these things, having a fever is not just a bad side effect that you need to control. It's your body purposely doing it. So we know much more now, not to like all fevers are bad. I mean, a very high fever, 104. I mean, yeah, you're going to start denaturing proteins, but a normal fever, just let it run its course. Other cytokines, okay, this figure here, just to talk about, just so you see cytokines in general, you can see that cells like neutrophils or macrophages make cytokines, and they influence other cells. They get them going. In the immune response, remember helper T cells that make cytokines that would get B cells and T cells excited. So cytokines are chemicals that get cells excited. And you can see many different cells can produce these cytokines. Yep. And then also you can see that you have chemicals that are going to try to resolve the inflammation, to stop it, to downregulate it. So this interleukin 10 and some other ones will be involved in winding down this response. Yes, so the inflammatory response is stereotypical. All these things always happen, but they can have some variations here. But just some things to keep in mind. I just made this kind of summary slide. Lots of neutrophils means probably a lot of bacteria that you need those cavalry to go kill. Lots of macrophages means that this response has happened for a while. They're not as quick. And you're removing some big stuff. You're removing dead tissue or foreign material that got into your body. When you breathe dust into your lungs, macrophages will take care of it, big stuff like that. When you see a lot of edema, when you see a lot of swelling at the area, it means there's a lot of histamine. That begins it for sure. And when you see fibrin, when you start seeing it walled off, that means that the infections was such severe enough that your body is trying to do what it can to localize it, to keep it from spreading. All right, so that was all acute inflammation. It's what happens when you guys have some kind of injury or infection like this. Your body does this inflammation to get rid of it, the bad guys, and to protect yourself. Now, chronic inflammation, you'll hear quite a bit about in terms of health. It's being blamed for a lot of things, and people talk about how to stop chronic inflammation. You'll hear a lot about this, but this is obviously long-term inflammation, and you don't want that. It should just be inflammation should happen, should fix you, you should wind it down. But when you talk about having inflammation for weeks and months and years, it's not good for your body at all. It's also used when you, as a pathologist, you can look at a tissue and say, oh, that's chronic inflammation. You see particularly lots of neutrophils and macrophages in blood. You can say, oh, that tissue is showing inflammation. Looking at acute, you can see trauma, burns, frostbite, right? When I'm looking at chronic, I'm looking at autoimmune, cancer, fibromyalgia, things like that, yeah. So with chronic inflammation, you don't usually get the big edema and hyperemia. Remember, more blood vessel. You sometimes don't see that obvious sign, as if you cut your finger, you see that big red, swollen, bad-looking cut, right? So it's usually doesn't do that, but you have behind the scenes there, if you looked at it, lots and lots of your white blood cells going to fight the fight. Not so much neutrophils, where that's more for acute, like quickly to get those bacteria. But you see, you've got the macrophages, which are longer lasting, and you got the lymphocytes, the T cells and B cells. And so that's what you see in a chronically inflamed tissue, is neutrophils are acute, come quick, cavalry, kill right away. Chronic inflammation, you've got these long-term cells. And when you can't look at a lymphocyte and tell if it's a B cell or T cell. I mean, you don't know what it's doing exactly, but it means that it's cell-to-cell combat. It's making antibodies, and it's doing more of this long-term specific kind of fight, unlike neutrophils that eat anything that's not you, right? And then fibrosis is more common. Sure, with long-term, you're going to start walling it off. And here's a picture you can see, it's liver tissue, and you can see, chronic inflammation is causing more fibrosis. That blue is connective tissue that's taking over more and more of your healthy liver tissue. So why would you have this chronic inflammation? Why can't, that means you haven't gotten rid of the bad guy. Like, it could start as an acute inflammation, and it's just persistence. So whatever's causing it, you can't get rid of. And so you have this chronic inflammation. And by this time, it's you or just your immune response, right? B cells and T cells. And sometimes you have osteomyelitis. You had an infection inside your bones. And some people, you can't get enough antibiotics to actually get rid of it. So you just got to kind of control it. You always have kind of this low grade response. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can see that, foreign bodies. Let's say you have buckshot, it's kind of dramatic, or you have a splinter that broke off inside of you, you can never really get rid of that bacteria. So your body always has this immune response to that. And it's particularly troublesome is when you have necrotic tissue. When you have an area of dead tissue in your body, it's kind of walled off from the circulatory system. So your white blood cells can't get there to fight the fight. Your antibodies can't get there. Antibiotics can't get there. So necrotic tissue, when you have it, you really got to usually kind of get in there and dig it out. You know what I mean? You can't just, because once it's in there and walled off, your body's just going to have a slow fight on its hands, right? Instead of, because it has no way to really get to it. Now, in this case, we're talking about without an initial acute. What if you it didn't start that way acutely, but just a persistent of low-grade inflammation? Yeah. And so it could be, look at things like hay fever and various viruses and things like that, syphilis, so viruses that last a long time, you have this just a kind of a long-term inflammation. And yeah, looking at this, I just got this simple thing off the internet here. Good. You have some kind of trigger, cut, bruise, infection, your body hits it hard, and then good job, you're done, back to business. Chronic, maybe a non-serious event. Yeah, you're a certain food, a certain kind of trigger, and then sure, inflammatory response, but then it keeps the inflammatory response on, and that's going to cause long-term ill health. All right, a lot of these chronic inflammation can cause these granulomas. So inflammation that's going to cause you to be a kind of walled off area, these focal areas. And it has a typical kind of look. You've got a center where these macrophages just get huge. Sometimes they seem to meld together like many nuclei, these huge ones right there. Then you got a bunch of deeply packed, closely packed macrophages. They're called epithelial type because they kind of like tightly packed like epithelium. Yeah, and so this kind of area here, there could be something in the focal area or not. Now it's just left with a bunch of these things. And these granulomas can be big. Some you can see with your bare eyes, but they will grow. And your body is kind of like walled off these little areas to try to isolate it, you know, and these granulomas form. And you can see some pictures. You see granulomas, these like yellowish bumps in various tissue. Yeah, and small ones can just fiber off and then they're okay, you know. People with tuberculosis, they have these tubers in their lungs, and they're, as long as they don't open up, it's kind of like asbestos. You can sometimes just encapsulate it safer than trying to like tear it out. Yeah. I just found some pictures here. You can see a couple granuloma skin diseases. So these things are where your body kind of encapsulate these. Type of lupus. Annulary means ring, like little spots there. And then I got this too, some other causes of these granulosis. Leishmaniasis, it's a big problem in the tropics. It's carried by a little biting fly you find in sandy beaches. And then look at that, fish tank granuloma, it's interesting. Cat scratch disease. So these are various, you have a lot of fungi down here. We see a mycosis is a fungal disease. Myco means fungus. You don't see a lot of those in humans, athlete's foot, a few things, but normally we don't have that many. But bacteria, a lot of bacteria. So these things cause granulomas. Look at that. Yep, syphilis can cause granulomas on the skin. You can see that. TB I talked about. Yeah. So foreign body granulomas. I got this picture. It's actually from a monkey, but the same works with people. You can see that's definitely a hair fragment. Maybe it gets caught in the lung, and your body encases it with those macrophages, and it makes this granuloma. Yeah, and you find out what causes it. Take a biopsy, maybe try to plate out what's in there to see if it's some kind of bacteria, something you can identify and through patient history. But yeah, so foreign body granulomas, and your body kind of encases something that doesn't like. All right, now we get down to a few more terms and we'll be done with this lecture. Exudates, maybe in nursing a lot, it's the stuff that comes out of wounds, you know. Yeah, gross. So it can be pussy or not, but Exudate is going to be, it's a collection of fluid that's going to come out. It's usually because the pressure is very high, or you don't have a lot of blood proteins, and so the osmosis doesn't suck the water back, and so you have this edema, this Exudate that comes out. And look at the picture, you can see it's clear. We'll see Exudates usually have proteins and stuff in them, right? But Exudates are pretty watery. And an exudate is something that's going to come out. Usually, like a transudate, if you have high blood pressure, there's going to be, or heart failure, you're going to have backup of blood. A person with a congestive heart failure is going to have a swelling of their neck and their limbs. This water is going to swell because the heart can't get rid of the blood. So there's a backup of pressure, and that pressure is going to cause water to leak way more than it should out of those capillaries. And exudate's usually more localized in areas maybe of inflammation where the vessel's been expanded and more stuff leaks out. But instead of just water, it's so leaky that other things can get out through those holes. A couple cool diagrams to show you. Remember, normal, you have blood pressure, it's going to push the fluid out. Osmosis will suck it back in, with just a little extra, but normally that equals out. A transudate, is when you have, see the blood pressure is way high, isn't it? And maybe you have low osmosis. Let's say you have liver failure or starvation. You don't have enough proteins in your blood. That water's not going to be sucked back, and you end up with edema. You have this too much water. Yeah. And an exudate here, you can see the capillary is just big, and it has big holes, so it's very leaky. So fluid tends to leak out, along with plasma proteins can leak out too because the hole's so big. And so as a clinical example, pleural effusion is where you have fluid that's going to accumulate in your lungs. And one way that it can occur is if you have heart failure. The left side of your heart, let's say it's just not strong enough to get rid of the blood. What's going to happen? The blood's going to back up. Where's it come from the left atria before that? The lungs. And so blood's going to back up in the lungs. That increased pressure is going to cause more water to leave the capillaries in your lungs, and you're going to start filling up your lungs with fluid, watery fluid. On the other hand, if you have exudate type of pulmonary pleural effusion, you're going to have where the capillaries are enlarged and holy, and so stuff's going to leak out. And so that fluid is going to be, see, it's kind of yellowish because it's going to have the proteins that are in the blood too, not just the water that's being pushed out. So it's a good example you can see of these two terms. And you can classify types of exudate here. You can see serous always means watery. So in this blister, it's just going to build up. Pop that thing. And then you see a fibrinous, you'll hear, the next one talks about sanguinous, has blood in it. Fibrinous is going to have a lot of fibrinogen, often found. It's going to dry, form kind of a scab that flows out. And then anything purulent, nurses, rest of you, purulent means pussy. So purulent exudate is going to have that pus, which is going to be dead neutrophils and liquefied tissue and dead bacteria. Yeah, I found this online here. If you look at what comes out of a wound, what's seeping out of it, you can tell a lot by what's seeping out of it. And if it's just watery, that's normal. You're going to have a bunch of watery coming out. Sanguinous, sanguine means blood. You're going to see, you can see that it's going to look a little reddish at first. Here's like a watery, bloody kind of thing. And then purulent is going to be thick, pussy. And so that means that there's still high bacteria infection going on there, if it's like a leaking out pus. And seropurulent just means a little more watery pus, right? So serous and purulent and some things in between. All right, inflammatory response, you guys know, red, swollen, pain, right? And you can take steroids to lower that, or NSAIDs, right? To lower the pain, lower the swelling. And the clinical manifestations of inflammation depends on how bad the injury is and where it is. With osteoarthritis, you may have a lot of pain, but you don't see much redness and swelling. Your gut, if you have something going on in the bowels there, because it's the innervation of the gut is not very specific. The patient will just tell you they have, abdominal pain, but they're not be able to really point out where it comes from. It'll be harder to find out where it is. Yeah. And when you have bacterial infection, you'll see usually see some a lot of inflammation, a lot of neutrophils, and tissue problems. An abscess. An abscess is going to be a collection of pus. And of course, commonly acne, comedones are little, when you have a sebaceous gland that's blocked and then fluid builds up, and then it's a good place for bacteria to grow, and so it becomes pussy like that. A boil is similar to that. It's going to be where pus builds up under the skin somewhere, can become quite big. And both of those, if you let the pus grow enough, then you can drain it, and it's cool. If you too early you try to dig in there, you can cause it to just the infection to spread. And that one right there is description for where the nail bed is. And parenchyma, yeah, I screwed that one up, didn't I? But that's going to be a common place to see some pus as well. Yeah, so an abscess often has to be drained, filled with pus. Cellulitis is very dangerous. You can die of this. It can spread really quickly. But here you're having the inflammatory response where your body can't control. It just spreads uncontrolling, and you can follow the spread. Skin and subcutaneous tissues, it's going to spread, and you got to give some serious antibiotics to try to keep it under control, or it's life-threatening. Related to that is this: you never want to hear you have necrotizing fasciitis. That's bacteria that's going to go in the fascia, the deeper, like surround your muscles and such. And so this is flesh-eating bacteria, right? So we got to bring out all the tools to get rid of those things. An ulcer is a hole. You think about ulcer in your stomach, your stomach or your duodenum, things like that. But you can have ulcer, you can see here in the lip or on your skin. Bed sores can be turned ulcerous. Ulcerous is an opening that doesn't really heal. And in terms of the stomach one, it's usually a Helicobacter pylori, kind of antibiotics will kill that bacteria in acidic conditions like that. The other causes for ulcers that cause an opening that doesn't really want to heal. All right, then accumulations are when you have stuff, some kind of chemical accumulate in cells that it's not supposed to. And it can be some kind of injury, but it can often be a genetic issue where your metabolism is not working so that you don't get rid of it's normally a waste tissue. Some bad diseases, Tay-Sachs disease is genetic, and you don't get rid of a lipid. You don't have an enzyme to destroy this type of fat, and you're born a normal newborn, but you die within a few years. It's very sad because you build up in your neurons this fat that can't be destroyed. It just destroys the cell. So genetic disease like that. You can see this one, there's a problem with folding the protein. So you end up, protein builds up in these cells, and eventually it's going to inhibit function. So one is accumulating fats. So fatty change. There's a disease called, fatty liver, and it's when the liver cells just start accumulating fat, and alcoholism is one. Can definitely lead to that. Usually this is non-alcoholic too. So there's other reasons to get a fatty liver. It's different than cirrhosis, which is like fibrous tissue in the liver, or liver cancer. Hepatitis is infection in the liver. So a lot of things, your liver is kind of important. It can go wrong. But fatty liver means that you build up, you look at histology, fat builds up in these liver cells and it starts decreasing liver function. And if it's acute, it can come on quickly and cause problems. You can have chronic where you have fatty liver, and something else will probably kill you before your fatty liver does. So there's all kinds of stages of it. You can accumulate too much glycogen. There's cases where instead of fats accumulating, these carbs accumulate, and you can't get rid of it. Normally you break down glycogen to release glucose, right? And there's various protein buildups, some weird diseases there too, where proteins build up. and including amyloid. You've heard of amyloidosis. And they find that in Alzheimer's in the brain that one area of research is that amyloid builds up. And so maybe we can figure out why and clean that up. And then you can have too much calcium building up. If you have a condition where you have too high calcium levels, it's called metastatic, where calcium builds up in cells in your kidney especially, or dystrophic. During dying cells tend to accumulate calcium too, and they can kind of find out where cells are dying by the ones that are hoarding the calcium. Then you'll hear hemochromatosis is a genetic disease where you keep too much iron until it's toxic. And so iron builds up. And then Wilson's disease, I believe, is where you hold on to too much copper. You might check me on that, but I'm pretty sure. And then I always thought when cells age, they build up this lipofuscin pigment. And so you look at older cells, they have a lot of this pigment. Just over time, it just is like garbage building up you can't get rid of. All right, and lastly, repair. So you have damage to tissues, and what about repair? Well, obviously it's going to depend on the nature of the injury, how well it can be repaired, and what does repair mean? Are you going to replace the damaged area with brand new cells, or just going to make a scar and just try to like paste over the damage? Yeah, so it definitely depends. And then look, this is from your book here. You can see this whole, the cell death and the inflammation phase and repair can vary. You can see a short-lived injury, bam, inflammation happens, and then you can see repair takes longer. So you have a skin cut. You may think you covered over the scab, but it's with a scab and then a scar. But then it doesn't get to full strength until like weeks later inside there when it's made those connections. You can see a prolonged injury and then chronic injury. Look at this. You're in constant state of inflammation and issues. So regeneration is good. That's like, dude, we're going to like, you just destroyed that part of your liver. We're going to make new liver cells. That's going to work. Yeah. And that doesn't work for everywhere. Like I say, your heart, your brain, those cells don't normally divide. So if you have a piece of your brain destroyed, it turns into scar tissue. The glial cells, the astrocytes just fill up as scar tissue. Your heart, you have a piece that dies because of an MI, it fills up with just scar tissue, and it's just fatty scar tissue. It just is dead. It's not going to beat anymore. But your skin, oh, you fix that, right? Broken bone, well, we can make new bone. So it just really depends. And your bone marrow is a good example. You know, because of bone marrow transplants, you can take out all your bone marrow and just have someone give you a few cells, and it's going to just fill up and replace all that formerly defective bone marrow. The other thing is you can fill it up by scarring, just by making tough connective tissue. And it's not going to restore the function, but it's going to bind it together, and you're out the door. You can still survive. So you'll often see in, you look at a cut, you pull a scab off, you see like granular tissue in there. So the granulation tissue stage is where your body fills in the gap with fibroblasts, make collagen fibers and connective tissue, and then it can remodel it to what it's supposed to look like. And a bone is a good example. As soon as you break it, you get a hematoma, blood forms. Then you form this callus, which is this softer tissue that's fibrous and fibrocartilage in there. And then over months, your body remodels it into bone, and then it remodels the bone. So it's almost looks good as new. So you got this stage where your body quickly throws something in there to repair it and then takes the time to remodel it. All right, looking at, you want a good plastic surgeon or a cheap plastic surgeon, right? Well, again, if you have a cut, the best thing to do is to put those two ends of the skin right next to each other, right? Primary union. Suture, tape, super glue, whatever. Because what happens is then there's very little gap that will fill in with blood clot and then connective tissue. There's very little gap. The blood vessels will quickly go across that gap, and you'll have a nice heal. If the wounds is left apart, you lose a bunch of skin in there, it's going to be a much bigger scar. And your body does it. It'll fill it up with connective tissue just to protect yourself. And if it's a big wound, you should know the term debridement is when, so you get a motorcycle accident, your leg is scraped across the asphalt, you'll lose a big hunk of skin, it's got debris in there, bacteria. That's where you go in, very painful to brush and get rid of the dead cells and get rid of everything. You need to really get it clean. And then maybe a graft, skin graft is in your future. And this is from the book. You see beautiful. Here that you've lost some epithelium, but what happens as long as you've got some basal cells on either side, they'll grow together and you'll be good as new, really. If it's left a big gap like that, you can see Exudate fills that in, and granulation tissue, fiber is going to go in there, and eventually this is fibrous tissue, a scar underneath there is going to be solid, hard material. Yeah, this is another view that you can see that. So by suturing or bringing those edges together, you have a much less of a scar. And my last slide, finally, we're looking at this. How well your body can respond to this insult is going to depend on several factors. How virulent is this infective organism? Is it really bad necrotizing fasciitis, or is it just a little staphylococcus or something like that? So it depends how bad it is. Your age, the younger you are, the better you're able to deal with repair. Yeah. Your nutrition, to heal, to make collagen, you need vitamin C, proteins. So nutrition will allow you to heal better as well. Age, nutrition. If you have diabetes, your blood vessels are smaller, there's going to be less perfusion of blood, it's going to take longer to heal. And if you're on steroids for asthma or something like that, that steroids inhibit inflammation and healing, the immune response. So all these things are going to play into that. All right. And that concludes chapter 4. A big one. I split into 2. But you need to understand inflammation. I mean, and what exudates are. All these things are just it's what your body does in response to this insult. It's going to do an inflammatory response. It's going to happen. It's going to stop, hopefully, and it's going to help you survive. All right. Chapter 4. It's a wrap. Hope you guys are doing well.